Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about something that happens to a lot of us, to most of us, to be honest, and that is our child or teen or young adult's anxiety or OCD comes back. It's returned. And what do we do when that happens? How do we handle it? How do we coach our child, teen, or young adult through it? So I want to cover that today and kind of go over some expectations, some initial thoughts about when it happens, and then what to do about it. But before we get started, I would like to thank OCD for sponsoring this episode. OCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they're available in the U.S. and outside the U.S. You can schedule your free 15-minute consultation to see if OCD is the right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com. That's treatmyocd.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. If you want your child to understand OCD in a better way, which is really part of giving them those tools to be able to spot when anxiety or OCD is back and giving them the tools to navigate through it when it does come back. I think that's so important. I'm such a big proponent of giving our kids their skills and their tools independent of us so that long term they have these on tap when there is a flare or there is a setback and anxiety or OCD shows its ugly head. They've got their tools. So I do have a free class for kids and teens to understand OCD, to let them know they're not alone. And I have 12 kids and teens who actually help me with this class. It's actually the first class of my course, Crushing OCD for Kids and Teens. So you can take this class for free at natashadaniels.com/understanding OCD. All right, let's jump into today's topic. So let's just talk about, why does anxiety or OCD return? That is often a huge question in my AT parenting community when I'm talking to parents. They're like, why has this come back? Sometimes we get stuck on the why. I think when anxiety and OCD first show up, we get stuck on the why. And when it comes back, we wonder why. What happened? And here are a couple of things that can, well, more than a couple of things that can play into it, but it's different for each kid. The first thing is that anxiety and OCD tend to be cyclical. And so there doesn't have to be a reason why anxiety or OCD is coming back. It just does sometimes. Sometimes it's really high and heightened, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes themes are popping up all the time, and sometimes it's really quiet. And that's why they say, anxiety and OCD is somewhat of a chronic condition, but I don't like to think of it in a negative way. I feel like you develop a lifestyle similar to if you have diabetes or asthma or any other condition, that you learn how to maintain it. And there are times where things have to be adjusted because you're going through a harder time. The next possibility is something triggered it. And the trigger is not typically the problem. The problem is that anxiety or OCD is waiting to grab onto something, and it found something to grab onto. And so sometimes we put too much credence into the trigger, like, oh my gosh, we shouldn't have said that to her. Or, oh my gosh, I can't believe that teacher did that and it triggered this. Or we shouldn't have signed them up for this, or they shouldn't have watched this movie. But in reality, if anxiety or OCD can stick onto something, it means it was waiting. It was sticky. Does that make sense? I always think of especially OCD as an octopus. And I don't know if you ever saw these little this octopus toy. We used to have a couple of them in my house. They're really tiny. You can throw them on the wall and then they crawl down because they're like sticky. You probably haven't seen it. It's just a random toy, but they were fun. I had them in my therapy office too, because you could throw them up on the ceiling and they would stick there, and then eventually they would kind of fall down. But it was better you threw them on the wall, and then they would it would look like they're crawling down because they were made out of a sticky, plasticky substance. when they were not sticky, no matter how hard you threw it at the wall, it wouldn't stick. And I feel like that's a great metaphor for anxiety or OCD. When it's super sticky and ready to grab onto anything, it will stick onto anything. And that is the bigger problem. And we can't really prevent that per se. We don't know when anxiety or OCD is just sticky and waiting for an opportunity, but a trigger can happen. And so it can really be anything. And that actually is what happened to us. Partly why I wanted to do this topic, because one, I hear about it all the time in my AT parenting community with members, and they're going through a relapse. And often we'll get members who will rejoin us after a few years of not being a member because they are having a relapse and anxiety or OCD is back. And so they need to reconnect with all their support systems, and we're included in that, which I love. We just had the AT parenting community open for a little while. By the time that you're listening to this, it will have been a few months. And we got 11 members returning because anxiety and OCD goes away for a while, and then it does come back, and you want to kind of reconnect to all your supports. That doesn't mean that anything wrong happened or that you did something wrong to cause it to come back, or that your child's not using their skills. It just is somewhat of a cyclical disorder. So in our house, a few months ago, and I've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast already, but this might have been at this point, maybe 4 months ago. I have honestly no sense of time. It's actually kind of a problem. But I think it was about 4 months ago where my daughter was going to take an advanced placement test for math. And she was so anxious about it. And when she was going to bed, she felt really nauseous. And honestly, I think she was nauseous because she has celiac disease, and I think she ate something that didn't agree with her stomach. She has a lot of stomach issues. But she threw up. I'm trying to think if she felt like she was going to throw up or she actually did throw up. I think she actually did throw up, because that was the big scary thing, because she has the emetophobia, the fear of throw up, and social anxiety tied into her emetophobia as one component. And in her brain, something automatically snapped, and she was like, what if I'm anxious about this test tomorrow and I actually just threw up because I'm anxious? And one of the things that I always tell myself is that when I'm anxious, I don't actually throw up. But now I have evidence that I do. And I kept saying to her, you probably ate something that disagreed with you. It's just a coincidence. But that was enough to completely trigger her emetophobia came back. She started to develop anxiety attacks, which she had never really had, just random anxiety attacks about anxiety. She was anxious about becoming anxious because she thought that if she became anxious, she would throw up. So you can see, that rabbit hole. And everything came back full force. Now, was it the math exam's fault? No, her brain was sticky, and it just made this causation of, I threw up, I was anxious. Now, when I'm anxious, I'll throw up. And that was enough to throw her into a complete relapse where her anxiety, not really her OCD, but her anxiety got as bad as it was when she was in first grade. She's in sixth grade now. So that's a trigger, right? It was just a really weird random trigger. The third way that anxiety or OCD can return is through environmental factors. And so that was a very particular trigger for her. And so, we don't need to split hairs as far as the causation of why it comes back. But I'm trying to say the trigger is a little bit different than an environmental factor, but they can overlap. But this could be a change in schools, or parents get divorced, or there's a death in the family, or there's a trauma, or they're at a different developmental stage. And so all those environmental factors, and developmental stage, we're going to talk about physical factors in a second, but I'm talking about, just being at a different stage of life. Conversations are taking a different turn. If your kids are getting into the tween and teen years, they're hearing things and seeing things at a different level than they did before, which can bring things back. And so environmental factors can play a role. Not that we can change that, right? I hope you're getting the message that it's not like you can prevent these things. We can't control, per se, when anxiety or OCD returns. We can control what we do about it. Very similar to what we can't control when anxiety happens or when we have intrusive thoughts, but we can control how we respond to them. The last one I want to mention are physical factors. And so hormones can be a big issue. And so not for every child, but for some kids, when they are going through puberty, they might have anxiety or OCD return. Now, I've seen lots of kids go through puberty and their anxiety or OCD did not return. So you don't have to necessarily worry about that and hold your breath until that happens. But hormones can play a role. Also, illness can play a role. And so if your child gets sick, or if they get strep, or other issues that create stress in the body or inflammation in the brain, those can all bring anxiety or OCD back as well. So those are just some possibilities just for you to understand why, right? You can't prevent those things. And when anxiety or OCD does return, it brings with it a lot of stuff for us and for our child. It can feel really overwhelming because I think there's a part of us, and I don't know about you, but for me, there's always a part of me that thinks we're behind this. Even though I know that's irrational and I know it's not true, I think we're done with this. Or like this theme is over, or we've already conquered that. And so when it comes back full force, for my daughter, we're talking about, first grade. So we're talking about 5 years where it's been like, she's had bumps, but it has not been immobilizing for her in over 5 years. So when it comes back, you're like, oh my gosh, it's very overwhelming for most of us. There is a grief that I think happens with some of us that this is cyclical. Like there's an awareness at that point, especially if it's the first time that it's coming back full strength, that this is a journey, like this is a lifelong journey. And so that can feel really heavy too. And there's a grief of sadness for yourself that you're having to deal with this again. And that's not being selfish, that's being realistic. And sadness for your child that they're having to go through this again. And they don't get to just have this like carefree life that we want our kids to have. And there can be fear of the what if. Oh my gosh, if she's having it now, what if this happens in college? What if this happens when she's an adult? What if she can never function? The what ifs can drown you. And then there's a feeling of feeling defeated. Like, well, we did all this work. And for you, maybe you went intensive outpatient, or you did medication, or you did intensive therapy. And you're like, we did all that work and now we're back to square one. So what is the point? There can be a feeling of what is the point? Why do all these things if we're back to this? And a lot of those feelings are mirrored with our child. They feel overwhelmed. They're like, I thought I got rid of this. They have grief that this is something that they're going to have to deal with periodically in their life. They have a lot of what ifs of, oh my gosh, what if this is happening to me next year? What if this is happening to me in college? Or what if this is happening? What if I'm not able to function? I mean, they grow their own what ifs, and they can feel defeated and even more resistant for treatment because they can develop a story that says, it didn't work because I'm back to square one. And I do feel like part of that is how we frame things when they are doing well, when they move into maintenance. I know when I had my private practice, I would make sure to convey to kids when they were done with ongoing regular therapy that anxiety and OCD is cyclical, and not to be negative. I wasn't one to hold big graduations and give them a medal when they left and have like a goodbye graduation party. I was pretty intentionally muted. We would celebrate all their brave wins and we'd celebrate how they no longer need ongoing therapy. And then I would remind them that periodically they will still see me for maintenance, because even if you have a car that's brand new and it's running perfectly, it still has to go and get some car maintenance in order to keep that progress or keep the car running well. Same thing with anxiety or OCD. So I did downplay a little bit of like, yay, you're graduating, because I'm not a fan of that. I know a lot of therapists do that. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's for this very reason. I don't want kids to feel like a failure when they hit another bump, which they inevitably often will. And I want them to be like, oh, yeah, Natasha said this was going to happen. This is normal. This is common. And I just need to like tune up my skills and get back on the road again and not get derailed completely. And so we can do that as parents. We don't have to depend on the therapist. We can do that as parents when they are doing well and they're in maintenance, that you say, you know, I love that you're doing well. And I do have a podcast on maintenance if you want to check that out. That is episode 195. If you actually go to my website at atparentingsurvival.com And even if you go to the search button and you just type in maintenance or you type in the number 195, it will pop up for you. And so, when your child is doing well, communicating with them that says, how to spot new themes, how to be aware, and that it is normal for you to hit a bump, but the tools that you're learning are lifelong tools. So what I notice is there is a spectrum of attitude when our kids are in maintenance mode, when they are doing so well that they're subclinical. And the spectrum is, and most of us are going to fall in between these two, somewhere on the spectrum of head in the sand. We don't want to talk about anxiety or OCD. We don't want to mention it because it seems good and we don't want to rock the boat. So we're going to act like it never happened. We're, discontinuing therapy if we had it. We're not talking about it. We're not touching base. We're like, do not breathe that, because if we do, it's almost like a superstitious feeling of, if I mention it too much, maybe I'll bring it back. So head in the sand. On the totally opposite end of the continuum is the hypervigilant parent who sees everything through the lens of anxiety or OCD and really can't enjoy the maintenance stage because they're thinking, well, maybe I missed something. Maybe they're doing mental compulsions. Maybe that's a compulsion and I don't recognize it. And so you're over scrutinizing, and maybe that's all you talk about with your child, or, you're calling out, is that anxiety or OCD? Is that your OCD? And so we don't want to think everything is anxiety or OCD, and we don't want to think that we can't even bring it up because we're going to cause it. So somewhere in the middle is good. And it's hard to find that sweet spot as a parent and as a child. So after the break, I'm going to go into what we do when it comes back, what we do as a parent with our own mindset, and what do we do to help our child navigate through it. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have that was desperately needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it's kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realized that it was helpful to do the exposures. Before it was really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it. So it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com. Welcome back. When the anxiety or OCD comes back, we're going to start with you. And I know we never want to start with us because we just want, give me the tools, Natasha. Tell me what I need to do with my child. We forget, and this is a big part of the work that I do in the AT parenting community and with you guys on my podcast, we forget that we're not a blank slate. We are wearing a lens, and we impact our kids with our own energy and with how we approach these things. And so it is very important and powerful to always start with ourselves, how we're approaching this, what we're doing, what we're thinking. And so some reframing for your own mindset when this happens, and I had to do this myself a few months ago, is remind yourself you are not starting from square one. I have seen so many kids in my practice, so many kids in the AT parenting community do really, really well for a very long period of time, hit a bump, and they tend to get better quicker after the first time. Does that make sense? The first time a child has anxiety or OCD, it is typically the most overwhelming because often we don't know what it is. It's scary. We don't know how to approach it. We don't know who to connect with. We don't know resources. We don't know anything. And so, and a lot of times it's the most acute, it's not cute, it's acute, the first time around. And so it really knocks our kids off their hinges, and it knocks us off the hinges. Typically the first time is the hardest because we're grieving and we're experiencing and we're learning. But if you found me and you have already connected to resources and you know what it is, you have connected them, you've educated them, they built their skills, especially if you were able to get them into maintenance. And so the parents that I've seen that come back the next time, it's a different journey. It's not the same journey that you went on that you are so anxious that you're returning to. And I know that I've experienced that myself. Like my journey with my daughter at 12, now experiencing this hiccup, is so different than my journey with her when she was 6 or 7. She's a different kid. She's approaching this differently. She has more knowledge and information in her head. She wants me to do different things. And so you're definitely not starting from square one. And that's an important thing to remind yourself, that you are not starting from scratch. The next thing is really important to anchor ourselves. Instead of jumping into the deep end and drowning with our child, we have to anchor ourselves. Lovingly, and they say this a lot, like lovingly detach yourself from your child's struggle and center yourself and ask yourself, what is my role in this experience? And I know that is so hard. And for me, it was really hard this second time around because, and it's really not the second time, she's had lots of bumps along the way, but this is like the first time that she's kind of appeared to go all the way back to the severity that she had when she was in first grade. But my role was different. Back then, I was teaching her skills and teaching her stuff for the first time. What is a red thought? What is a green thought? How do you talk yourself through your anxiety? All that kind of stuff. And she wanted me to have a different role. And the role changed since last time. How she wanted me to help her was different. She had all this information and tools. So I wasn't creating them, but how do I support her? So it is helpful to get tunnel vision, and this is easier said than done, not over catastrophize. And this was really hard for me because my head was starting to spin where I thought, because she was having major anxiety about leaving the house. And I thought, oh my gosh, she's going to develop agoraphobia. She couldn't go out of the house for really anything. She was worried about hanging out with her friends outside of the house. She was worried about going to restaurants. She was worried about eating in front of other people because eating equals nausea, which equals possible throwing up. She certainly wasn't able to go to school, even though she was doing it. And so it was pretty easy to catastrophize and think, she's not going to be able to go to school. She's not going to be able to go out. She's going to, it was super easy. And then we have all these trips planned because we travel all the time since my husband passed away. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to go to Japan, which I know this kind of sounds like a selfish thing, but I didn't want her to have anxiety on our trip. And that was 6 months ago. And now we're leaving in a few weeks. But by the time you listen to this, I've already been to Japan, hopefully, knock on wood. So getting tunnel vision and just saying, what is your role? How am I supposed to support them? What do they need from me? And that might look like I need to reconnect them to treatment. I need to reconnect them to services. I need to ask them, what do you want me to do? And so that's what I did with my daughter. She was having these anxiety attacks. And I won't call them panic attacks because it wasn't like out of the blue. Panic attacks are like a physiological false alarm in your body where, it feels exactly the same as an anxiety attack. But anxiety attack is very like situational. So whenever she was about to go somewhere where she thought she could lose control, she would have one. Or if she was at home and she was thinking about leaving or doing something outside of the house, or something was coming up the next day, which always inevitably was, she could have an anxiety attack at home, but she's anticipating something. And I asked her, I said, when you're having an anxiety attack, how do you want me to help you? And so we have to revisit our role and ask our child, when you're struggling, what would you like me to do? Or when I see you doing a compulsion, what would you like me to do? What's my role? And they might say nothing, and you have to respect that. I notice you involve me in this. And we know from the past that when I get involved in doing what your anxiety or OCD wants, I help grow it. So I'm not going to do that, right? So you move right into space. If you're not familiar with space is a treatment approach for you to systematically pull back your involvement in anxiety and OCD. And so maybe you need to revisit that, or maybe you need to learn that in general. But, and I do have like a space study course in my online school at atparentingsurvivalschool.com that walks you through that. But when I asked her, because in the past she would have anxiety attacks, I don't know if I'd call them anxiety attacks, she'd just like be really panicky. And I would have to prompt her and I'd say, well, what are your green thoughts? What are your red thoughts? And I teach this in my anxiety course. I don't do this for OCD. This is an anxiety thing that I do. And even though she has both. And she'll tell me all of her fears. I'm afraid I'm going to throw up in front of my friends. I'm afraid I'm going to do this. And then I would spoon feed it a little bit. And I'd be like, well, what are your green thoughts? And she'd say, well, if they're really my friends, if I threw up in front of them, they'd still be my friend. And if they weren't, then they're not good friends to begin with. She had all these ideas of what her green thoughts were. We worked on it. We built it. But when she was in a panic, I would kind of prompt her. What are your red thoughts? What are your green thoughts? But now, fast forward 5 years, I didn't know if she wanted me to do that. She seemed to be working through things on her own. She has been in therapy recently. Before the hiccup, I had already gotten her back into therapy just so she had a place. Thank goodness. I wasn't sure if when she's going to school and she looks like she's working through it, if it would be worse to say, are you doing okay? Or like give her an opportunity to talk about it, or if I should ignore it and act like it's not happening so that can help her, or if she wanted me to talk to her and maybe help distract her and act like it was normal. So I didn't know which way she wanted me to go. So I asked her, in the mornings, I notice that you're struggling, and I notice that you're feeling really panicky. And I wonder what reaction for me is the best. Is it better that I acknowledge that you're struggling and I'm there to support you and kind of talk through with you? Or do you like it when I act like I don't notice? And if I act like I don't notice, is it helpful for me to like ask you questions about like your day or play music and sing to kind of inadvertently distract you in that panicky moment? And she said, surprisingly, I like it when you pretend like nothing's happening. That helps me. And that was so different than what she was when she was 6. She would not want me to ignore it. That would have been really overwhelming for her and like not validating her struggles. But our kids change. And so ask your child if they're willing to communicate with you what your role is in it. They don't get to choose, though, the aspect that you pull back, like your involvement in the anxiety or OCD. And then the other thing is we want to cheerlead our child and work with them on what tools they can start to tap into. And so communication is an important one. How are you going to communicate about this, right? We talked about that in the beginning when you were new on this journey. What do you call it? What are you going to refer to? Like my daughter used to talk about her anxiety and OCD as O Cloud. That was the name that she picked for it. And now that she's 12, I notice that she doesn't personify it. She will personify it in the sense that she'll talk about my OCD is bothering me, or my OCD won't let me enjoy this, or my anxiety is bothering me. And so she'll personify it in that she'll talk about it as kind of an inanimate object, or like not an inanimate object, but like she'll personify it. You know what I'm trying to say, but without the name. And I noticed that happened with my son too. He kind of dropped, he used to call his anxiety and OCD squishy. Well, it's mainly his OCD, he called it squishy. And I noticed that both my kids, as they got older, they just dropped the name. And not that I think you shouldn't personify it and name it with older kids, because I do think it's really helpful to externalize it if they're willing and able and like to do that. But because we've been on this journey for so long, I noticed that developmentally, as they got older, they just stopped calling it by its name and just started to talk about it like, oh, my OCD is really trying to ruin this for me. So revisiting communication can be helpful. And they might have a new theme that's more embarrassing, that maybe is taboo or sexual, or maybe they're at a different stage of development where it's not as intuitive for them to just go and share everything with you. They're at a stage where they're more private. And so that can be a different aspect of the journey that you're currently on. But you do want to normalize the ups and downs of anxiety or OCD with your child and remind them that they have skills and the skills have not gone away, that they are still there, kind of laying underneath the surface, and that all we need to do, or all they need to do, is really just tap back into the resources and skills that they already have. And I reminded my daughters, like, you've done this before. You have been in an equally bad situation before, and you clawed your way out of it like the true warrior that you are. And I know that you'll do it again. You have all the skills. You know exactly what things you need to do. It's just riding the wave of that anxiety. So that's kind of comforting for them to hear that from you. And then you want to reconnect to treatment. You want to reconnect to resources that you tapped into before. We luckily already had a therapist going on, but, had a med assessment. Does she need more medication at this time? Do we need to reevaluate what medication she's on? Those things were really helpful. And, like I said, we have lots of members that come back all the time because they found that the resources were really helpful when they need it. And then when things are going well, some stay and some leave, and then they come back. It's an open door for members that have been members before. If you've been a member before, you can always rejoin at any time. You just have to email us. We only open the doors to the public about 4 times a year. But old members, there's always a back door that you guys are always welcome to come back to. We never want to not be there to support you. The last thing that you want them to be aware of is to not catastrophize, which is hard if we're doing that as well. I know I had to work on myself and be like, you know what? We have traveled before when she was anxious, and we'll travel again, and that's fine. She'll get through it. And sometimes she really surprises me. And I'm talking to her about backburnering things and just looking at what's going on today, what is going on tomorrow. It's just like, next steps. We're not going to look any further than, the next few days, because that's all your anxiety can manage. And that is very helpful to only focus on your next moves. And so that's been very helpful for her. I know for us, I have watched her really claw her way out of anxiety again. She's a super strong person. And I've watched a lot of that work that she did when she was younger, and all the work that we did in between from 6 to 12 was still there, because she would talk out loud, and I could hear her and her processes, which were the things that I had spoon fed to her when she was little. She would say, oh gosh, I want to go hang out with my friends. And I'd be like, well, you don't have to, which is probably not a very good therapist thing to say. But I'm like, it's a choice, right? And she goes, yes, but I know if I don't go, then it's going to be harder to go the next time. And I really want to hang out with my friends, and I don't want anxiety to take that away from me. And so I need to go, but I'm feeling really anxious about going. And so then I just would say stuff like, well, what do you need to tell yourself? And she's like, I got this. She doesn't want to engage with me at all anymore. That's normal for 12, which is almost 13. That's totally normal. And I've watched her work through it, and she'll just tell me, shh, don't talk. I'm working through it. That's different. Those are old skills, right? That she's tapping into, that she no longer wants to do with me. She wants to be independent. And so I've had to do my own work of, this is her journey. Let it go. Like, don't be anxious all day looking at the phone, wondering if the school's going to call you. Let it go. She's at school. You dropped her off. Now you need to move on to the next thing. And that is hard to do, but important to do, because this is her journey, and I am just one part of it, and I'm just there to support her. So she is doing a lot better. We did increase her medication, but she is just not avoiding. And she signed up for the talent show. And I was like, why are you doing these things to yourself? So now she's super anxious about the talent show. And I said to her the other day, you don't have to do the talent show. And partly I do that because I want her to know that it's a choice. And she's not the kind of kid who, like, once given permission to not do something, she backs down. It actually kind of empowers her. And she said, I know, but I wanted to do it and I don't want to disappoint my friends. And I said, well, what's the true person underneath that? Does she want to blossom and like be on stage? And she's like, yeah. And I'm like, then you fight for her, right? She wants to be on stage and she wants to do that. And it's anxiety that's robbing her of that versus putting yourself in a situation that you really don't want to do anyway. And now it's triggering your anxiety. That's different. So I'll stay tuned for that one. That one's a work in action right now, or a work in progress. She may not even make it, there's auditions. So, but it's very stressing for me because I have social anxiety, and like just watching her perform, if I have to go to it, it's going to be very overwhelming because if she messes up and she's on stage, it's like I feel her pain and then it's my pain because it's embarrassing. Oh my gosh, all sorts of layers. But I'm back burnering it. I'm like, it's her deal. It's not about me. I'm not going to think about that right now. What a way to push yourself, right? I mean, that's a warrior, in my opinion. I mean, I know she's my daughter, but we can really celebrate our kids and their success. And when our kids are going through a bump, they need the reminder that they are awesome, that they clawed their way out of these things before, that they're incredible, that they are so strong and so resilient, and that they're having a hiccup, but to be patient with themselves and they can get back to where they were. That's a really powerful, powerful message. So I hope things are going okay with you. I hope that you found this helpful. If you are finding my podcast helpful in general, I appreciate it when you write a review. Thank you for those of you that do that. You can rate it where you listen to your podcast. Just hit a star. But when you take the extra 30 seconds to write a review, it really goes a long way, and I do appreciate it. And I always end my show reading one of the reviews just to show my gratitude. So I want to thank Loving It, that's their username, who wrote a lifeline. Natasha is providing a much needed service for parents and kids who are struggling with anxiety and OCD. The floor that falls out when you find your child struggling seems bottomless, and it doesn't seem that there are enough professionals with the knowledge to tackle this very treatable, counterintuitive issue. So grateful to be able to lean on the wealth of knowledge as we learn to navigate this labyrinth. Thank you, Natasha. Well, thank you for taking the time to write that review. And you're so right. Like, it is counterintuitive, but very treatable. And why there are not enough professionals who understand, in particular, OCD is beyond me. And I hope that the world will change that. And I hope that my little drop into the world is changing that. And I want to bring all this information right to the source, which is you guys, the parents who are in the trenches. So maybe if you write a review, I'll be reading yours next time. Don't forget to find the sparkle in everything you do, and I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.